Welcome, welcome. We are so glad to have you here for our 6th edition of APUS Skills Prep. My name is Nicole Moretti, and on behalf of the Bill of Rights Institute, we are so glad that some of you have decided to join us. Love to know if some of you are on spring break, if you get to have spring break, if you're sick of being on some kind of break. We're just glad that you're spending your time here with us and hope you're finding this to be a valuable experience. Tonight, we're going to talk about major turning points in American history. So many things that you're probably already familiar with, that your teachers have already covered, and the complex thesis point. We want to make sure that you utilize the chat tonight. Let us know you're out there. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what's happening in your world. And please, please, please ask questions. So we're going to turn the time over to Mr. Daniel Jocz and let him do his fantastic groovy thing that he does for us, and let him take it away.
All right, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon to everyone here today. It feels weird to be APUSHing during spring break. It is my spring break, but it is a pleasure to kind of be here with you all wonderful people. So today, we're going to be talking about kind of this big idea of turning points in American history, and really kind of looking at some of the skills that you are going to need to demonstrate. Whatever part of the test you're taking, it's going to inevitably kind of have two pieces to it, the content piece and the skills piece. So we're going to be really taking a look at just kind of comparison, causation, but a lot of conversation about continuity and change, and my least favorite subject, which is unicorns, the complex thesis point. And for those of you that do not know, because if your teacher's kind of like me, I almost avoid this conversation in class because it's so confusing. You know it's going to be a bad situation when it is called a part of the rubric for the DBQ and LEQ is called the unicorn point. That's how like elusive and mysterious and some would say that's how rare it is this complex thesis point. But today, my good people, I'm going to tell you why, even though it's all those things I just mentioned, it's still worth thinking about, because it really reveals your ability to think historically in a nuanced, complicated way. So if you've been APUSHing all this time, you probably don't even think about, but you're getting used to doing the kind of causation thing, right? What causes events? What are the short term? What are the long term causes of particular events? Like I said, we're going to take a look at patterns of change and continuity over time, comparison, how are things similar and different, and then just interpreting things. That's going to be a very important part of today's process. But before we kind of go any further, let me kind of give you this idea of continuity and change over time, because it is something that is going to happen over and over again when you're going through the material, is looking at and describing, as it says right here, patterns of continuity and or change over time. And that's just a fancy way of saying what continuity, what stayed the same, and then what changed as a result of a historical event or phenomenon or what have you. Now, when you want to kind of go to the next level, you want to think about explaining those patterns. It's one thing to be able to describe them, but then explain them, why or how that the things are changing, or in some cases staying the same. And then finally, the relative historical significance. And we'll go into that piece a little bit more in just a moment. And so I want to kind of hit you right off the bat with a question to give you an idea of what it looks like in real life, because you may have already done this. You may not have even heard the idea of turning point. But let me show you a question that's kind of like a really kind of important question, maybe stimulate your brain. This is probably something. When did you cover the Constitution? Like, what month was it? Curious in the chat, when's the last time you thought about the Constitution, or even better yet, the Articles of Confederation? You might be going like, what was that? What was that, like an essay? What's going on? The Articles of Confederation. And so when's the last time you thought about that? Because that's what we're going to kind of take a look at to start us off here. And then I'm going to kind of zoom in on this topic, and then we're going to zoom way far out and then take a look at kind of some of the other big moments in American history that I think it's worth your time to kind of examine. All right, Kay, you got November there. It's been a long time, right? Probably before Thanksgiving, September, my birthday month. Yeah, it's been a while. And especially in like 2020, 2021, everything feels like extra long. And so you may be a bit rusty. So let me kind of give this one a go with you all about the idea of continuity and change over time. So here's a question. And in my opinion, kind of wordy, but a question you might see, and here's how it goes. Evaluate the extent to which the ratification of the United States Constitution fostered change in the function of the federal government in the period from 1776 to 1800. And before I go any further, I want to let you know that in the description, there is a link to the Google Doc with the Google Slides. So you don't have to worry about trying to jot all this madness down. While you get that, I want you to think for a moment about the kind of parts to this question and what it's really asking you. And if you would, in the chat, like, what's this thing trying to do? Like, what's the purpose of it? And, you know, when you kind of talk about this, evaluate the extent, you got to have some sort of vision, dramatically, a little bit, in terms of the ratification of the Constitution. So what did that do? The moment the country, the United States, said, you know what, we are actually going to approve and put into force this new government. And then think about, what did that do in terms of the function? How much did it change and how much stayed the same when it came to the function of the federal government? And then it gives you a time frame. And before we go any further, and I'm still waiting in the chat to see kind of what you come up with. Like, what do you think of this question? Easy, hard? Would you have any clue where to take it? This is really asking you about the significance of the change in terms of the function of government from the period 1776 to 1800. And there's a little bit of a strategy I use with my students when it comes to this idea of these dates. And if you go to the website, and the link is on the Google Doc. So you can just click this link right here. And let me just kind of show it to you. If you click this link right here and you scroll down, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. But when you get to this point right here, there's a timeline that if you click it, it is periods 1 through 5. And we're going to stay in periods 1 through 5 tonight, because I realize some of you are, you know, you're at different places in the curriculum. And, you know, maybe you haven't even gotten to World War II. Maybe you're already like, you know, in Vietnam. Maybe you were with us yesterday in Korea. But if you take a look, these are the significant things that have happened. And I see some people coming up with some good stuff about this question. We're going to take a closer look at it in just a moment. But these are the dates that I really recommend that you should try not to remember all of them. But if you are familiar with the kind of the order, at least, you're going to be in a good position. And here's why. So let's scroll up here really quickly to this question that we got right here in front of us. These are the date ranges it gives us. So we know 1776, and most people would probably be able to kind of identify 1776. That was the Declaration of Independence, right? That's the moment where we said, nah, it's not you, it's us, to England. We broke up with them, and it literally was us. We became the US. We had to actually win the war, but that's independence, Declaration of Independence. That same year earlier, Thomas Paine's Common Sense dropped, I think in January. And if we take a look, you have just kind of the American Revolution time frame up until 1783. I see some people are talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. Maybe you're thinking, oh yeah, there was that Shays Rebellion. And then the Constitutional Convention happens in 1787. Chances are none of you remember that, and that's okay. 1789 is when the new Constitution kind of goes into effect. George Washington becomes the president. So articles are bye-bye. Remember, when we talk about ratification, you know, the convention happens in this period. I think it's ratified in 1788 once they get 9 of the 13 states. I could be wrong, but it's around this period. That's ratification, which is what the question's asking. And then you have the 1790s, which allowed us to have a wonderful musical that we could watch now on Disney Plus. Fun fact, y'all, because I was late to the Hamilton party, but I was lucky to actually see it in person and then watch it on the Disney stuff. And I will say, if only you watched it on the Disney, it's nowhere near as good. So some of my students were like, man, it's not that great. What's the hype? You have to see it in person. Like a musical, it doesn't translate as well. So if you've watched it and you're like, hopefully one day you'll get to go check it out once the world reopens. And then 1800, which is when the question ends, is the election of Jefferson. So a lot of you have some really excellent ideas in the chat. You're talking about kind of creating a more powerful government. You're talking about the government being able to put down the Whiskey Rebellion because we had the ability to raise an army. There was a sense of order, I'm seeing, set up a government, a central government. You got August mentioning the creation of the executive and judicial branches, which did not exist previously. So if we go back here, I really recommend that timeline because it helps frame your thinking. And the way I think about this idea of turning points is this. Oh, Joe saw it in Louisville. Lucky. Chicago. Oh, see, y'all seen it. So, you know, do you agree with me that the seeing it live is like phenomenally way more better than seeing it in person or on the TV? I had a bunch of students who were like, and I said, take my word for it. And you know what? Before we went on lockdown last March, my students were supposed to go in May to go see it at the Pantages Theater in Los Angeles. We had tickets, but we didn't get to go. But boo-hoo. Anyways, 1789. Think about what's before, what's after. Before is the Articles. And if you think about, and I'm just kind of quickly reviewing, just in case you're like, you know what, I fell asleep during the Constitution. Can you please review? 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. Y'all know that, right? And once again, if you don't know these dates, don't freak out. Then 1783, we get our independence. Look at America, it's so beautiful. She's even smiling. Got all that area in green up to the Mississippi River. There were a whole bunch of challenges. Yeah, you know what? No, I'm not going to respond because I don't want to get too sidetracked here. The Articles of Confederation was the first government. And once again, I would not know this unless it's on this slide deck right here. The Articles are adopted. Eventually, the Articles of Confederation are ratified. For your purposes, just know the Articles of Confederation is the first government, the first national government. It's the government we use during the American Revolution to eventually coordinate the war and then kind of win the war. You have the Treaty of Paris, and then you have problems. In 1786, people are like going, you know, we got some problems with trade. And then other people are saying this dang Shays Rebellion, we can't raise a military. You know, what are we going to do? There's economic problems, whole bunch of stuff. 1787, you get a constitutional convention. And then, of course, remember, at the Articles of Confederation, you know, when they were creating it, they don't want a government that's too powerful. Think of that song, and we will never be royals. You didn't know I was going to sing to you today. You're welcome. So they created a very weak government by design. It's not like they were morons and didn't know how to create government. They created a government that was weak politically, economically, and foreign policy-wise. I think of growing up in the 90s, listening to SWV, Sisters with Voices, weak. And so this is why it's weak. It's not weak in a bad way, at least as it was created. They didn't kind of do it like, let's just make a really crappy government. They did this because of their experiences with England. They were wary of a strong central government. And so some of you already mentioned this. Some of you already mentioned this, right? There's no power to tax. There's no executive. There's no court system. To get an amendment, you need all 13 states to agree. Keep in mind, these states, they don't have a history of working together. You know, they're just 13 colonies. They were very different from each other. And then even to pass a law, you need 9 out of 13, which is a supermajority. And so that's the weakness. And eventually they all meet up. You got James, you got Ben, you got George, you got Alexander. The framers, they create a government, and that government addresses some of those weaknesses. What does this have to do with that question? The question's asking you basically from 1776, under the Articles of Confederation, all the way up to 1800, how did this government, the function, how did that change? And in saying that, it's also asking you, not a fan of the Constitution. Jefferson does not like it, right? Remember, there were people known as the Anti-Federalists who were not fans of it. And so eventually they sort that out, the Bill of Rights, and boom, the Constitution's ratified. Now let's go back to this question. Think of turning points. And here's the hardest thing, I think, for most people, especially in APUSH. You're in the 11th grade. You have 5 other classes. Some of you have friends, significant others, family, maybe a pet. To try to keep track of all this history in the pace that you have to go in is absurd. I always tell students, I studied history at UCLA, and my classes that I took were easier than APUSH was. No professor made us learn all this stuff or do all these types of tests. It's crazy. So the reason why I mention that is it's hard to think with complexity and nuance because you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to say, what is the Articles of Confederation? But if we look at this question, take a look at it. To what extent, evaluate the extent, there was change. When they say change, it's okay to say some things did not change. In fact, more often than not in history, there's always some things that stay the same and some things that change. Sometimes it's a lot of change. Sometimes it's a little change. Sometimes it's just a whole lot of staying the same and not much change. That's confusing. But this question's asking you to kind of think about the function of the federal government. That word choice is important, right? You can't answer a question they're not asking. So if you just start getting into, Hamilton and political parties and Jefferson and don't connect it back to the function of the federal government, that ain't getting you nothing. So let's take a look. And this is straight from the College Board's kind of guide. There's no mystery here. I wanted to go with their words since they create the test and it's all public. So you can kind of see it right there. Here's kind of 2 things they mention. They're not the only things. And for a thesis statement, and we're not really focusing today on thesis writing, but these are 2 arguments with lines of reasonings that you could use. And there's others. So they say you could say the ratification of the Constitution dramatically, notice they're using that word, evaluate the extent, dramatically change the function of the federal government by significantly increasing, there's another kind of evaluate the extent, significantly increasing the scope and distribution of its power. Now that doesn't really kind of tell you how, but that's what the essay is going to do. And also the next sentence, despite the significant change, watch what they're doing here. Even though there was a lot of change in the scope and distribution of political power, a considerable amount of authority remained with the states after ratification. Notice what that thesis does. It answers the prompt, but it also recognizes nuance. It recognizes, yep, the federal government is going to do a whole lot more because it has the ability to do a whole lot more under the Constitution. It does not get into the specifics. This one does. The ratification of the Constitution changed the function of the federal government by giving it the authority to tax and to maintain an army. there are certainly other things you can do. I think back to, I believe it was August mentioned, it created a president or the executive branch. It created a court system, which then it creates a system. There's so many different ways you could approach this prompt. But what's important is to kind of set yourself up for that complexity. When you think about continuity and change over time, or turning points, which is the purpose of this particular session, it's always important to kind of think, is there any qualifier that is appropriate? Let me go a little further here. This is the rubric, which is why this is so confusing. This is the rubric section for the complex understanding or the unicorn point. You know a rubric is bad when there's this much wordage in it. It's just wordage. Is that a word? Anyways, take a look at what they say. Demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. If you're like most people, you go, oh, okay, so what does that look like? These are all ways that you could do it. In my mind, the best way are the two that have arrows pointing at it. Guess what? Your teacher, your family, your best friend may disagree. But rather than stress out about looking at every single possibility, let's kind of think about how can we qualify, as Kate kind of mentions, that word however, or although, is that qualifier that sometimes allows you to set yourself up for the complex thesis point. And so one way you could do that is explaining both similarity and difference. So if you're doing a comparison prompt, which this is not, you know, what is similar, what's different, explaining both continuity and change. So I'm going to show you what it looks like in just a moment, or explaining if it's a causation question, multiple causes. Most things have multiple causes to them, you know, so maybe there's one cause that is the main reason. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the election of 1860, the cause of the Civil War. You know, there's different debates about that. I think the thesis we kind of used as an example talked about the role of slavery as overwhelmingly the primary cause. Others would argue, and you could get points still with another argument as long as it's backed by evidence, or explaining both cause and effect. Think of this particular one as that kind of nuance or that complex. It shows you understand that there's gray areas in history. It's not either all change or all continuity. It's not either always the same or all different. There's that kind of element there. Another way is by doing this. Let me actually show you what it looks like in real life. So these are the examples from the College Board. So if you think about it, you can get the point if you explain both continuities in government before and after the Constitution. So maybe you talk about there's many of the same leaders. There's not like a radical change on who are the people in government. You know, sometimes you have revolutions and certain class of people or certain groups are killed off or jailed. That doesn't happen in the American Revolution. You know, so there is still this kind of elite group who govern. That's the case under the Articles. That's the case under the Constitution. You could talk about how there continued to be an economic crisis, even though the government can tax. There was, which is why Hamilton's coming up with his plans of report on manufacturing, the bank. You could talk about a number of things. You could talk about, as the other thesis, there's still a huge amount of authority that state governments have. Even though they create a more powerful federal government, states still have a lot of power and influence in the United States, which is why some of you have been back in school for who knows how long, and I've been out for over a year. Different states, different local governments have tremendous power. Yeah, Malik, that's a great example. French Revolution, who's kind of leading? There's people losing heads. That doesn't happen. You can also talk about the changes, though. So there's a lot of continuities you could mention. You don't have to mention them all. You can also talk about changes, such as the expansion of the federal authority. Now you could tax. Now you have the ability to raise an army. Now you have an ability to, you have a president. All of that stuff is things that you could talk about. Okay. So there's a lot that you can spend, a lot of time you could spend on trying to figure out. I left these other ones in the Google slides so you could see other examples of this in terms of kind of corroborates an argument. But for me, for what I've been telling students, think of the gray area in history. Think about how you can kind of show the complexity part. That's been my approach. Your teacher may approach all of these, and that there's nothing wrong with that. More power to them. So we're not going to spend all day looking at this particular prompt because today's about turning points, and I want you to get a sense of what are the turning points in American history. And it's very subjective, right? If you ask one person, what are the most important historical events in terms of changing the process, the development, people would have all sorts of different of opinion. But let me do a little experiment here with you. I do this with my students when we're in person, so I haven't done it with them. So you'll be my guinea pigs. Here is a list of dates. I didn't count them. Let me count them. 11. I think there are 11. If there's not 11, put in the chat and make fun of me. But I counted. I was very under pressure that I was watching. You guys were watching me count. There's 11 dates here, I think. How many could you definitively tell me? And if the answer is 0, that doesn't mean you're going to fail the exam. But how many of these 11 could you definitively tell me what happened on that date? And obviously, many things happened on every date. But like, what is like one major thing that happened? Could you tell me a major thing that happened on how many of these 11 could you hit? You don't have to tell me what. I'm not going to call you out because the delay, I don't want to like sit here waiting for people to come in with their responses. But of the 11, how many could you say, I know what happened, a big moment in those 11? We'll see what y'all come up with. Kate's just already name dropping. She's like 1800, Jefferson. You don't have to do that yet. I just want to know how many of those 11 could you? Quick scan. How many could you say, I know what happened? And then, so is it like 2? Was that the only one, Kate? Columbus. You don't have to prove it. I'm just give me the number. You don't have to prove. I'm gonna take your word. We trust each other here. We're like good friends. It's our 6th session. Some of you have been at all 6, so it's like still waiting. People are still putting the. I don't want to know which ones. I think 4 or 5. Okay, thank you, Scotchy. 4 or 5. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. Scotchy. Okay. 4 or 5, maybe 4. Kate. Okay. Round 8. Okay. Hope does stuff is like, I got this. Matt's like, I'm going to tell you what one of them are. Malik 3. Does anyone know where these dates are from? I didn't just pick them because I was trying to like, show the dates that I thought were the best. Does anyone know why these dates I selected them today? Because this is going to be a really, I think, helpful tool moving forward. At least it's helped my pupils. So these dates, here's actually what happened, or some of the things. And once again, there's many things that happened. 1491 is pre-contact, just before Columbus got lost. 1754, one major thing that happened was the start of the French and Indian War. 1800, as Kate mentioned, was the election of Jefferson. 1848, there's a number of things that happened. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. I think what's his face was elected, Zachary Taylor. But Seneca Falls Convention goes down. 1844, it's out of order. That's on purpose. I'll show you why. Polk election. Yes. This is from the key concepts or the historical time periods. So 1877 is the Compromise of 1877, which ends Reconstruction. 1865 ends the Civil War. End of the Civil War, kind of the the period of Reconstruction, Reconstruction starts before the war ends, but the Industrial Revolution really kind of is the focus. Spanish-American War in 1898. There's other things that happen, but that's the kind of one I use. 1890, the closing of the frontier, the beginning of overseas expansion. Notice my stressing of overseas. End of World War II. Someone mentioned that one. I think that was Matt. And then 1980 is the election of Ronald Reagan. And 1 year after I was born. I was born in 1979, y'all. I'm old. These are all from the key concepts. As I mentioned, periods 1 through 5, there's a timeline. You can link it. It's in the description. But if you go onto the website or go onto the College Board website, because this is all from them, there are 9 periods in American history according to the College Board. They've divided them up. And these dates have been selected by their curriculum people as significant kind of markers to frame different time frames. They are significant in that you can make arguments that they were in some ways turning points or big moments where things could have changed. Maybe significant, maybe not as much. Okay. And so these time periods, and I put this in the slide deck, we're not going to go through this, but in these time periods, you have the APUSH curriculum that you are expected to know, periods 1 through 9. There's some links to some kind of, videos where I explain, okay, here's the key themes you should focus on. We're not going to spend time on that. And then right after that, what I'm giving you is, this is basically, and this is kind of what's in the video, these are the kind of things they expect you to know in period 1, for instance. I'll just kind of use period 1 as an example, because most people, you ain't got time for period 1. It's really cool stuff. Native American life pre-contact and post-contact is fascinating. Native Americans, adapting to the environment, the geography of the Western Hemisphere, coming diverse, all sorts of unique cultures and religions and languages. And then suddenly you get this contact from Europe and Africa, the Columbian Exchange. Life is changing, but some things stay the same. And so you have all of these things you're expected to know, and it goes up until 1607, which is the founding of Jamestown, which is actually the date I forgot to put in there. Darn, I forgot that one, 1607. And so the reason why I'm stressing this is these dates are selected for a particular purpose. And it's a simple one, which is kind of framing the curriculum. So 1607 is the establishment of Jamestown, and it goes to the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it was called in Europe. If you go from the French and Indian War, there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to know about. Once again, we're not going to try to cover all the periods today. That'd be silly. But, in periods 3, you're going from the start of the French and Indian War all the way up until the election of Jefferson, which the question we just looked at was very much kind of indicative of the content in that chapter. So, for example, the differences and similarities between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. So this, I kind of walk you through the big ideas, because most likely you've been studying, you've been going chapter, 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 test. Oh my gosh, forgot everything I just learned, chapter, chapter, test. Like now you got to zoom out and try to make sense of it. Okay, and then you go into the next period, Jefferson, there's a whole bunch of things going on, and it goes to 1848. And I need to kind of change that, because Seneca Falls isn't really the start. That's oftentimes the narrative, but there were people, women in particular, who were speaking out before Seneca Falls even. But it's the big national movement. And there's a lot of things you need to know about there. And let me show you something. This is in the College Board framework about period 5. And shout out to Kobe Bryant right now, because man, that dude was such a competitor, and I'm still in shock that Kobe is gone. But period 5 says this: focuses on how expansion led to debates over slavery, thus beginning with Manifest Destiny and the election of James K. Polk in 1844, and it spans the Civil War and Reconstruction and ends with the Compromise of 1877. Now, when you dive into that topic, there's a ton of stuff, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff you got to know. You got to know about Manifest Destiny expansion, how this led to new debates about slavery, how the North won the Civil War because of a variety of factors. There were a bunch of consequences for the nation, and then Reconstruction took place. And guess what? Next week, we're covering Reconstruction. Shout out to next week. And that ultimately ends with the Compromise of 1877. The reason knowing this and knowing these big ideas has value. I don't need you to go home or stay home and flashcard these 11 or 12 dates. If you add 1607, I think that's 12. That alone isn't going to help you. But if you start familiarizing yourself with different periods of history, if you can know just intellectually right away, 1930s, Great Depression, 1945, end of World War II. If certain things just trigger, it's going to help you when you get these essays. And so here's another example. The emphasis in period 6 on economic development logically begins with the end of the Civil War in 1864 and ends on the eve of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Curious, Malik, what do you mean? That's why it doesn't work. What's it? Want to clarify that, because I'm going to show you, one, just familiarizing yourself with these periods has a value here. So if you know that after 1865 is when you have all this stuff going on, which includes the Industrial Revolution, Native American Western expansion, Trans-Mississippi West expansion, you're able to kind of start framing the narrative. And so when you get a question that asks you what change occurred from 1776 to 1800, you know 1800's the election of Jefferson, you know not to go into things that happened in terms of government after Jefferson. If you know 1776 is the Declaration of Independence, you know before that you ain't talking about any of those things. The website link doesn't work, we'll get that fixed. And so you can go through all this stuff if you find it useful, but my whole point is knowing significant turning points or significant dates will allow your brain to kind of think big picture and change over time and continuity over time. So at your own leisure, kind of spend some time if you find it helpful to do that. 2 pickup lines, just in case you're single and ready to mingle. Quick mental health break for a moment. If you go up to someone and say, I'm no Thomas Paine, but you and I are common sense, they may look at you odd, run, scream, call the police, or fall deeply in love with you. And if you say the other one, they will probably equally respond in any of the above ways that I just mentioned. But that's the beauty of APUSH. So let's take a look at these dates that I just mentioned. And once again, I need to add 1607 when it came to Jamestown. And here's the deal. 1754 is another kind of big moment. These are not the only big moments. Don't get it twisted. Don't think if I just study these dates, I'm guaranteed to get a 5 on the AP exam. That's probably not the way it's going to work. But if you're familiar with these dates, you're able to frame the other events. If you know 1844 is the election of Polk, and the Mexican-American War doesn't happen until after 1844 because it doesn't happen until Polk is elected, it kind of eliminates you making a lot of mistakes on the essay or on an SAQ where it says, give one example that demonstrates how life for Native Americans changed from 1492 to 1607. Or what is one way America played a more active role in world affairs after 1945? And you know that's the end of World War II. That eliminates some of the other things that you may want to write down, but are historically out of the time frame of the question. So let's take a quick look at this other event, and because it's been a while, and that is the French and Indian War. In the chat, how is that? I'm gonna ask you a question they wouldn't ask you because it's going to be too simple. How is the French and Indian War a turning point, or what stayed the same? What continuities occurred and what changed as a result of the French and Indian War? Like, that's not a question you'll see. I'm going to give you a question you'll see in a few moments. But when you think of French and Indian War, what do you think about in regards to this idea of continuity and change over time? And for the purposes of this kind of mental exercise, we'll just call it from 1754 to 1775. That's your time frame you can kind of work with. 1754 to 1775. French and Indian War, what comes to mind there? You're like, that's that war where the French and the Indians were fighting. That's that war that lasted 7 years. Beyond those knowledge bombs, what types of things? Okay, Michael, we got colonists' feeling toward Britain began to change. No disrespect, Michael, too vague. That doesn't tell me anything. How? How did it change? For the better, for the worse? Like, and that's something that a lot of teachers and the AP graders will tell you. That type of statement, you probably know what you mean in your head, but unfortunately, we don't have the technology to kind of read that. We need, and I know on a chat too, it's like you just want to type really quickly because you're probably writing notes. How did it change? US started to attempt to achieve independence. 7 years war, global war. England began taxing the colonies because they were in debt, which led to the revolution because of taxation without representation. Okay, end of solitary neglect in the British colonies. Nationalists started to rise. Okay, we got some stuff. Look at y'all remembering things. This was probably like in August too, right? Doesn't August feel like 10 years ago? Recognized for the work they did for Britain, increase in taxation, taxation without representation. A lot of really good ideas here. I'm feeling like maybe this is going to be a success. Okay. And you know, at the end of this little Google Doc, I left you like some graphic organizers that I use, and they're really complicated because I wanted you to practice context. I'll show them to you. You could do the same thing with any of these events. Okay, so let's take a look at a real question, because here's the thing, y'all. They ain't gonna make it that easy. It's gonna look like this. Here's a question. And think about what things you typed and which of those might be useful for constructing some sort of argument, a thesis, and an evidence to prove it. So here's a question. This is a question that has appeared with modifications, and they've asked about the French and Indian War so many times. So you never know. It could be time number 30. But here it is. Evaluate the extent to which the French and Indian War marked a turning point in the relationship between Great Britain and the North American colonies. In the development of your argument, explain what changed and what stayed the same within the period 1754 to 1775. Now, before I go any further, yeah, and I agree, Scott, you know that like collective brain power is beautiful. Like you could be drawing a blank, but you start hearing people say things, you're like, hey, I know some things too. So I really stress, especially for those of you that, you know, are distance learning full time, meet up with your classmates. I know it's kind of lame, right? To like meet up for APUSH, like over Zoom when you don't have to, but it helps study. I want to challenge you to do something real quick here. And here's what I'd like you to do. Forget the part where we talk about what changed. Can someone tell me if we wanted to earn that complexity point? Because you already mentioned a bunch of things that you could use. Solitary neglect came to an end, right? There were new taxes because England was in debt. There was bitter feelings amongst the colonists. They wanted to move west, but the Pontiac's rebellion made England say, nah, you're not moving west because then you're going to get killed by native people who don't want you there. We're going to have to go defend you. So they put the proclamation line. Colonists began to feel like no taxation without representation. There were these arguments about the Enlightenment, about representation, natural rights. We could do a million things about change. What didn't change? If we're going for that complexity, in the time frame of the prompt that we have right there, what didn't change? Let's see who would. And the thing about the complexity point is it's not one sentence. And that's why it's hard to describe or to kind of teach. It's through your essay, you are showing your ability to recognize historical complexity. So anyone want to tell me? And while you're thinking about what didn't change, let me show you a couple things about this prompt. So this is a key concept. Remember, I keep telling y'all, key concepts. It's super lame to look at them. It's not fun. It's not history. That's not how I want to teach history. That's why I kind of every year go, should I keep teaching APUSH? But look at, if you read it, it actually tells you some stuff. British attempts to assert title control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. You could reword that bad boy and basically come up with the part of the essay that talks about change. Okay, Malik. Malik, I salute you. I salute you. You're scratching at it with that comment about loyalist. Here's what happens. Yeah, all the things you all just mentioned. So little quick thing. Remember, this is North America in 1750. After that, before that, and during 1750, there's a period of solitary neglect, which Michael Jackson would say the colonists were, leave me alone, leave me alone. And I ain't doing that twice. Then from 1607 to 1763, up until the end of the French and Indian War, colonies were just developing largely on their own. And so they were ignoring a lot of the mercantile laws. They were developing their own unique identities. There were periods where, the English would kind of insert themselves. There was that kind of Sir Edmund Andros guy and, moments where there was more control. But for the most part, pretty lax. Kind of like your parents going out of town for the weekend. You just kind of do what you want, most of you. And then, of course, the French and Indian War goes down. It's a world war. Doesn't just happen in North America, starts in North America. French get kicked out. England's in debt. England has to think, how are we going to manage these colonies? Because they're not the only colonies England has. And they're in debt. And so the Treaty of Paris, another Treaty of Paris, France is kicked out. Then now England has to figure out, now we have all this debt. What are we going to do with these colonies? And so solitary neglect comes to an end. And in the words of Michael Jackson, this is the start of something. You got to be starting something. And what that does is create some problems. England became the dominant power. All of this is in the slide deck. I'm just going quick because you already mentioned this. Colonial empire is bigger. England's in debt. There's contempt because during the war, remember, the colonists weren't really reliable in terms of fighting the French and their Native American allies. England had to do most of the fighting. Colonists were kind of bums when it came to the actual fighting, with some exceptions. And so they start reorganizing their empire. In terms of the colonies, I have no idea why I put Snoopy here. I was just thinking of Snoopy while I was making this. It united them against a common enemy, the French, created a common experience. Hey, remember that one war where we didn't really do much, but England came and saved our butts? Oh yeah, that was great. But it created bitterness because when the war is over, the British are starting to enforce new taxes, sugar, stamp, Townshend duties, as well as existing ones, the Navigation Acts. And this war is a game changer. Most students, when they write this essay, they would be like, the French and Indian War led to the American independence. It radically changed things. But it caused trouble, as Taylor Swift would say. And I'm going to kind of go quick. It led to all these changes. And all this, once again, is in the Google Doc that you can find in the description. And I see Kimberly kind of bringing up another really good point. Conflicts with Native Americans didn't fully resolve themselves or go away or dissolve. But here's the deal. The things that both Malik and Kimberly are saying show that complexity. Notice all these events. You don't need to know all these events. If you know all these events, you should go study American history because that's pretty impressive. But notice what does not happen. Independence isn't declared. There's resentment, there's bitterness, but remember when the Continental Congress met, even when they're shooting each other after they met the second time, they're still trying to, the majority. There's some who are more radical and saying, let's declare independence. But for the majority of colonists, up until 1775, independence was not on the table. Independence was not on the table. It's not like they're, riding bald eagles, watching Hulk Hogan wrestle, having chihuahuas with American flags, saying USA as they eat hot dogs, making cakes with American flags, because there were a lot of reasons why independence wasn't the go-to move right away. Even during the American Revolution, as Malik points out, there were loyalists. We don't know exactly how many. The estimation is probably about a third. So if you go back to our prompt, a really great argument would be the relationship fundamentally changed as the British began to assert more authority through taxes, proclamations, things like that. But they still, up until 1775, there was no clear call for independence by the majority of the leaders of the Continental Congress. So when you look at a question like this and you think about turning points and you think about just complexity, most students would see this question and they would automatically write something to the extent or something to the effect of the French and Indian War was a major turning point because the colonies declared independence from England. And that doesn't mean they wouldn't get points or they wouldn't have some solid arguments. And if this was a DBQ, chances are there'd be a lot of things that would show the animosity building towards between the colonies in Great Britain. Chances are also, though, there would be some documents that would reveal a more nuanced or gray version of history. Maybe there'd be a speech from a colonist saying, I don't think we should, say bye-bye to mama because, for a variety of reasons. And so when you're thinking about turning points and when you're thinking about the complexities in American history, and that's the problem I think we face today, right? Everyone is in their little tribes, their little corners. Everyone wants to be right. They're not willing to kind of see those similarities or those areas of gray. And so this prompt, and many of you mentioned, you don't even have to say because they didn't declare independence. You could even say, as Malik said, there were loyalists up into and including during the American Revolution. You could even say the thing with Native Americans, that would not necessarily work for this prompt because it's asking you specifically about the relationship between Great Britain and the North American colonies. And remember, the weird thing that happens during the American Revolution is some Native Americans fight with the British because they see them as at least keeping the colonies on a leash. They're not letting them run rampant into the West. So the Native American question wouldn't necessarily work for this prompt. But what if the question was, and let me kind of come back over here, because these are not the only dates you need to know. Another question I've seen a bunch of times, look at the impact of the American Revolution. And it's had a million different versions. To what extent did the American Revolution cause political and economic change in the period, blah, 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 or social and economic change, or they give you some categories, or maybe to what extent did it change the lives of women and Native Americans? And so, for example, Kimberly's point about Native Americans, if the question asked you to what extent did the American Revolution change the status of women or African Americans or Native Americans, you can then argue, well, it didn't really change it a whole lot for many Native Americans because Western expansion continued. Or for women, you could say something to the effect of, yes, the idea of Republican motherhood meant women had a very important role in the new republic, but women continued to be treated as second-class citizens. Or something we covered last week, the American Revolution led to changes in the North as states began to gradually end slavery, but slavery continued to expand and rapidly move west in most, if not all, southern states. Okay, so it's important, kind of the driving theme of today, and this is kind of the graphic organizers I'm just gonna kind of leave you with, because one of the things that you should practice is this idea of context, contextualization. And I didn't touch on it too much today, but just like what was going on before and after these moments. Context is kind of, what is the big ideas before the arrival of Columbus? And for instance, one thing you could put here, if you're going to use these graphic organizers, is, Columbus, prior to Columbus, Native Americans had adapted a wide range of unique and diverse societies based upon adaptations to the environment and the geography they found themselves in North America. Maybe give an example. Development after the arrival of Columbus. The arrival of horses fundamentally changed Native American life in places such as the Great Plains. And then think about, what are the continuities and changes? Even something like Columbus, where you would think it's all going to be, the Columbian Exchange, there's continuities there too. Remember the Pueblo Revolt? Native people didn't just lie down and say, all right, conquer us. They fought back. They signed deals. They made alliances. Pueblo Revolt, the Spanish got kicked out of the Southwest and had to accommodate some of the indigenous people's cultural traditions. So yes, they're still like forcing that Catholicism on them. But if you drive through the American Southwest even today, you will see a very rich Native culture still present. And that's because Native people were able to maintain some continuity of their own culture. And so these are some of the ones that I kind of spend time in my class, kind of breaking down. This one kind of really comes back to a thing we did, I think, week 2 or week 1, about political parties. Remember, this kind of leads to the official death of the era of good feelings and the rise of the Whig Party. So before it, there was an era of good feelings, but it's not really, because they're still disagreeing about. So if you find yourself kind of wondering, like, how should I study? This is something I think requires you to zoom out and really think about the big picture. And if you're thinking about going for that complexity point, going for that unicorn point, being able to recognize nuance is going to be, I think, your best bet for doing it. So we got a minute, and I would love if you have some questions. These are some examples of other ones that are released by the College Board. So you'll see that it's not always just those dates from the key concepts, but it could be things like World War I. How did that change our relationship in world affairs? How did the Civil War change government? The 19th Amendment, how did that change the lives of women? And so these are some examples that we've seen in the past. These are some of the big ones you should at least be aware of. And even if it's not a turning point question, I guarantee you're probably going to get some questions about these events because they're significant. They're the markers between the key concepts. Next week, we're actually going to look at, in great detail, this one, Reconstruction. So please, I've been saying that the DBQ is going to be on Reconstruction for a couple of years now. And then last year they had like 30 DBQs. So there's no predicting the DBQ this year, because there's going to be a ton of different versions. But Reconstruction is a very important topic. Right about now, you're probably getting into the civil rights movement. And so you're gonna need to understand the defeat of Reconstruction to understand why there's such a need for a civil rights movement. Any questions? Put them in the chat. I'm gonna finally stop talking.
Thank you so much. Hey, as I used to tell my students all the time, your teacher has no way of knowing what questions there's going to be. And so I would always tell my kids, I'm going to expose you to a mile wide and an inch deep. And at least you've seen it. So that's why I was dropping in some things from the Bill of Rights Institute's website. Seneca Falls wasn't the beginning of the women's rights movement. There are all kinds of things on there you could look at. And those are the kinds of things that when you get to the DBQ and those kinds of questions, that when it says bring in information from your outside, what you've been exposed to, if you're checking on some of these other things, they're brief, they're easy to read, they're quick. That Clash of Empires that I dropped in about the French and Indian War, it has practice questions. So I would encourage you, if you are a little rusty on some of these things, hit the search bar on the Bill of Rights Institute's website, and it'll bring up some of these just really brief things that you can just review. And we hope you will join us again next week. And we'll have 4 more of these. So hopefully you are coming back and joining us for those. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next time.